Welcome to Whatsoever More or Less. My name is Jason, and today I've got a thought after having listened to the National Constitution Center last night while doing my chores on the homestead. About an hour long thing talking about Governor Morris, who I guess was kind of the scrivener of the Constitution. I've heard Madison called the scrivener of the Constitution, but that's fine. I think Governor Morris was in charge of the Committee of Style or something like that, handled most of the writing himself, is what a lot of people say. And it was a very interesting thing to listen to. I'm going to call this part of the mess of originalism. Okay, when you're playing around with trying to find what the tradition was of what people intended versus what was actually written down, that at some point people are going to start hunting for their favorite one to quote. And I see this in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, right? So we recently had Dallin H. Oaks speak about the mantle. What an amazing, awesome talk, right? In other words, the prophet's the one who receives the mantle, right? That sudden level of responsibility and spiritual fortification that you don't get when you're an apostle, apparently, I don't think. And that seems to be the case. Um, Although you can usually look and see who the Lord's been preparing to take that mantle on, right? That's been kind of my experience. You can almost kind of predict it, almost kind of see it coming, right? But people will like to appeal sometimes in the church to, well, Hugh B. Brown said this, or B.H. Roberts said this, or James E. Faust said this, or something like that. Or I heard it through the grapevine that in the minutes of such and such meeting, so and so had a problem with so and so. They're pitting prophet against prophet. I don't recommend it. I recommend rather look through all the words of the prophets and get a big picture. It's much more productive, way more productive. Your testimony will grow. Now, this is what's going on with the founders. So, Governor Morris, this National Constitution Center, which I believe the government pays for the National Constitution Center to exist, they do some great stuff, but also they've got some kind of public sector type bias, I think, kind of like PBS or NPR or something like that. Is basically, so I take it with a grain of salt whenever they start talking like this. Plus, to top it off, I take everything with a grain of salt anymore these days, unless it's original writings. And I've kind of picked who I feel like has had that mantle, for example, from the founders. I'll tell you who's had that mantle from the founders: Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. That's who had the mantle. That is the tradition of the founders, right there, right? If you want to point to some cool traditions that each one of them started, right, or some food for thought type traditions, Washington was offered to have permanent presidency or kingship, right? Said, "Nah, I'm good." Steps down after 2 terms. He had the potential to take all this power. And he says, "Nah." Adams, people like to pick on him for the Sedition Act. He didn't write it. He didn't request it. And to him, Congress had been the branch that represented the people for so long, which it still is. That's kind of the main point. That he didn't want to stop them. He didn't want to interfere. And so even in signing the Sedition Act, John Adams was cautious. He didn't want to exercise more authority than he was allowed to exercise. But he had the power to exercise the veto. So a lot of people pick on him because he didn't veto it, right? People pick on him because of the way he dressed and stuff like that he wore more like military garb or robes, kingly robes, things like that, whatever, stuff that looked more like, it's like picking on a 19-year-old kid or an 18-year-old kid for wearing a suit and a tie and everything like that while being on their mission, right? I think he wanted to, represent the office well, and that was just his best way of trying to do it. So that's a really cool tradition that he gave us too. Sorry, I'm stuffy, and I'm in here where I've been taking care of my goat kids that have recently been born because it's real rainy out. And so at some point it does kind of get to me. So I apologize. Then Jefferson, the tradition of saying, hey, if something's unconstitutional, violates the Constitution, I am going to stop it. I'm not going to participate in it, and I'm going to be nervous about letting anything happen that's unconstitutional. He needed Madison to help explain that the Louisiana Purchase really was constitutional, right? But Jefferson had that attitude of pushing for individual rights and individual self-sufficiency. Madison, uh, he wanted a bigger government. He was one of the guys that had the most ideas when they went to the convention, Philadelphia Convention. But they got what they got, and he stayed true to what the negotiation was. So he stayed true to the structure that was set up. Okay. And then Monroe, he wanted that era of good feelings, but he was willing to say, when they tried to pass stuff that was unconstitutional by then, he was like, okay, this is what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to veto it. Stop it. If it's unconstitutional, stop it. And so that's something he did. He told Europe, stay out of our affairs, right? Don't mess with us. He was just as interested in being friends with the South as with the North, and vice versa. So that's the tradition of the founders. And these guys were the guys who had the mental, who had that pressure, who were elected by all 13 states one way or another, right? At least the cumulative electoral college, the way it was set up, right? So, but instead we're going to talk about Madison or Morris or Hamilton or somebody like that, because they have some view that wasn't held by those five guys. and people want to push for that view nowadays. They in this stupid National Constitution Center thing, which I felt was quite uninspiring, except for it inspired me to recognize some of the messes we have going on nowadays. They wanted to keep talking about his anti-slavery stuff. Okay, that's cool, great. That he's like the ultimate anti-slavery person for that generation. Cool. And I think, every person, God used every last person that was involved in getting the Constitution to its final complete version with the Bill of Rights and everything, as President Oaks compliments in defending our divinely inspired Constitution in the five principles, right? By the time you get to the final product, it is good. And if there's errors in it, they're errors of men, but they're not terrible errors. And so Governor Morris wanted the Supreme Court to be the final arbiter of the meaning of the Constitution. Hamilton did too. Didn't actually make it into the Constitution. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe totally didn't believe that at all. And they knew the text just as well as any of those guys did, right? They were all there. They were all part of the early generation. They knew what was up. It's not like Jefferson was an incapable reader and writer, right? It's not like Madison was unfamiliar with the Constitution. Go figure, right? Washington, having been there for the whole convention, right? Managing it. So they knew what was up. And no, they didn't turn to the Supreme Court. Hey, tell us if this is constitutional or not. No, that wasn't a thing. But Governor Morris wanted it. Hamilton wanted it. And Federalist 78, all that kind of stuff. So this is the problem with, you recently heard me complain about originalism. Also about treating judicial opinions as though they're somehow like binding meanings of the Constitution for everybody else. I call that the bad seed, the enemy seed. It looks like it's the Constitution, but it's not the Constitution because it isn't. There's no process written in for it. There's a process written in Article 1, Section 7. There's a process written in Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2. There's a process written in Article 5. There's a process written in Article 7 that was the original process. They got everything going. There's no process for supreme power, judicial supremacy, right? But Governor Morris, they like talking about his anti-slavery views and how sexually active he was, and how he manipulated the style of the Constitution to try to get as much of his ways as he could anyhow. One of my major complaints, and I think he was involved in this, is Article 1, Section 8 is laid out in a certain way to where it's obvious that when you read from Clause 1 to Clause 18, that everything else in between is enumerated, relevant to what's in Clause 1, right? So debts, and then general welfare, and then common defense, right? So general welfare would be intellectual property, post roads, uniform rules of naturalization and bankruptcy, weights and measures, coinage, all that kind of stuff. That's the Commerce Clause, right? Interstate Commerce Clause. Interstate Commerce Clause. And all that stuff is the power to borrow money, right, is the first thing that's enumerated. And that's the first thing that's laid out, too, in the explanations for why they're going to tax, right? It's dishonest, by the way, to see general welfare and common defense without seeing to pay debts prior to it. So let's say the whole thing altogether. pay debts, general welfare, common defense, because that's what it actually says in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. All right, it doesn't just say general welfare and common defense. All right, then look, in Article 1, Section 7, the first clause deals with who has the power of the purse. All right, and they're already talking about the power of the purse. Also, like what is it? Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned according to population. What is that? Section 4 or something like that. Section 9, you get into all these cautions about how taxing is going to be done. Right? You would think, maybe that the founders were nervous about any justification for any taxing whatsoever, and so the Constitution was going to have lots of explanations for any taxing at all would be done. Right? So the grant of power was not pay debts. General welfare and common defense in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. The granting of power was revenue for these three purposes, which then those three purposes are laid out in the enumerated powers. With them, finally, the necessary and proper clause, clarifying very clearly if there's anything that has to be done in order to pull off the previous powers, then we're allowed to do it. By the way, we have coyotes. It's mating season, so I apologize if all my guard dogs are going off like crazy. It's the coyotes' fault. So, anyhow, then you look at Article 3, though. The comma placement is whacked, right? Article 3, Section 2. It's the same sort of function as Article 1, Section 8 and 9 and 10, probably, kind of, right? Really, that opening phrase is more like Article 1, Section 70. Honestly, that opening phrase, the judicial power of the United States shall extend to all cases arising under this Constitution. No, all cases in law and equity arising under this Constitution, the laws of the land, and the treaties. The comma placement is whacked. And they say he did that on purpose to mess with the meeting, and nobody discussed the idea of judicial power extending to all cases, period. That was... and that's not what it means, because it can't be what it means, because right there it ends with a semicolon and continues on all the way through to create this whole new sentence. So let's talk about who the actual tradition of the founders is. The tradition of the founders would be the first 5 presidents. That's the best way you can represent it. But even turning to tradition, no, just turn to the text. But in English language rules, you aren't truly reading the text unless you read the complete sentence, and often even the complete section or the complete paragraph or the complete article in full context, right? And this is what's so important about Madison. Madison was excellent in explaining that. He understood the structure. He understood it really well. And when you cherry pick your favorite clause, when you cherry pick your favorite verse in the Bible, when you cherry pick this, when you cherry pick your favorite little phrase within a verse or something like that, no, you're not being intellectually honest. And so you get these people picking their favorite replacement for the tradition of the founders, Hamilton or Morris or something like that. And then they say how Morris was the greatest anti-slavery guy and the greatest, sexually free guy, and this guy who lost faith that the Constitution would succeed because too much of it wasn't. You know why I think he lost faith? I think it was because of his lifestyle. He was way too sexually promiscuous. You cannot continue to have faith in mankind and anything like that when you're that kind of person in your own private life. And so that's what I'm going to say. I think about Governor Morris. I think he was a fantastic contributor in so many ways, just like David was a fantastic contributor to the Bible, or Solomon, or somebody like that, right? And but overall, there are other people that are, the actual dispensation heads, the ones who actually had the mantle, right? And I think that was my main point, is there's this tendency then of scholars to try to dig up anybody else. And I guess there's an even bigger point. Originalism, when you get into originalism, ultimately you're going to create a mess. The only valid application of originalism is, what were the original definitions of the words or phrases if they were legal phrases, right? But you have to prove it's the actual legal phrase, right? Because law and equity is not the same as cases in law and cases in equity, for example, right? Equity had its own separate legal meaning as it was back then. So law and equity is an instruction, all right? In other words, the judicial branch is to look at the laws and to look at the equitable principles of the case. That's what they're supposed to do. And then these are the kind of cases they're allowed to look at, right? That's it. Anyhow, trying to dig up these these other unsung heroes of the founding, if they didn't continue through and stand up to the scrutiny, to the mantle, to the stewardship in the end, if all they were theorists, right, then I'm not that impressed. Dallin H. Oaks has a great quote I'm going to defend here. This is a Madisonian quote whenever you bring it up. And Madison did not believe in the judicial branch being the final arbiter of the meaning of the Constitution. And it says, they also mean that none of the three branches of government should be dominant over the others to prevent the others from performing their proper constitutional functions to check one another. The only way the judicial branch originally should have been checking the other branches is if a case is brought before them, right? And they look at the law relevant to the case and they say, wait a second, we can't even enforce this law. Now, that doesn't make their opinion binding on everybody else's oath of office. It's just the way they read it, right? You've got serious constitutional scholars disagreeing. To ever make the opinion of any one branch binding on all the other branches is crazy. There's another one here. The principle of separation of powers has always been under pressure with the ebb and flow of one branch of government exercising or inhibiting the powers delegated to another. Okay? There is no power delegated to the courts to define what the Constitution is. It is not there. And so once again, the principle of separation of powers has always been under pressure with the ebb and flow of one branch of government exercising or inhibiting the powers delegated to another. If the Supreme Court claims that the Constitution is what the courts say it is, malarkey, as our great Joe Biden of the past would say. Sorry. I don't know where that came from. Probably from him. I'm going to blame him. Oh, now I feel like watching Babylon Bee, if you know what I'm talking about. But anyhow, no, this is... to become the Constitution, it either goes through the Article 7 process, which is the original process, or the Article 5 process. That's it. Those have very specific thresholds, parameters, procedures, what have you. 75% of state legislatures, that's a huge number of people. That's who says what the Constitution is. And then other than that, we are to be governed by law, right? So here's... Which previously, he says earlier on in this talk that the Constitution is a written Constitution. Our loyalty is to the Constitution, right? Which is a written Constitution, as he said earlier, right? Now, I'm not claiming to speak for President Oaks, but I can put two and two together after a while. And to top it off, he's following in the footsteps of other prophets who have said out and out, no, the Constitution isn't what the Supreme Court says it is. That's not allowed, right? John Taylor had no hesitation speaking for himself on what the Constitution was. Brigham Young, Ezra Taft Benson, all those guys, right? So, anyhow, I just wanted to go ahead and kind of pick on this, trying to find the guys who never had the mantle, and then find the ones that give your view that you hope will become the mainstream view. And then saying, hey, this is originalism, we got to start applying this in the courts. No. I think the originalism is textualism. The originalism is textualism if you look at Jefferson and Madison, but a cautious textualism. When in doubt, not exercise the power, right? That's Washington. Didn't want to stick in office for too long. Adams didn't want to step on the feet of Congress, right? Jefferson was really cautious. Madison didn't want to undo the whole structure the way it was supposed to be. Monroe, same thing. Let me make peace with the states. Let's all try to work together. I don't want to trample on the feet of the states, right? That's the tradition of the founders. It's textualism, pure textualism with the original definitions of the words, with caution. With caution to not claim too much power into yourself. That's the tradition of the founders. Not Governor Morris, not Alexander Hamilton. Neither one of them ever had the mantle. Sorry, this was a long one. Go listen to that episode if you want to kind of have some food for thought. One of my great guitar professors once said that he would go and buy all these different guitar method books, and he said, I always learned something even from the worst of the guitar method books. I learned stuff from Governor Morris. I appreciate him. I think he was a great contributor, just like David and Saul were great contributors. or Solomon, I mean, or Saul too. Let's go with that. Sure, right? I also think Isaiah was a bigger contributor, Elijah was a bigger contributor, etc. Right? We gotta have to have like some common sense about these kind of things. So anyhow, thanks for listening, you guys. See you later.